Hi y'all, I'm Olivia Stricker. I apologize for the horrible quality of this recording. It's really dark out right now. Not a ton I can do about that. But for my research, my predicted thesis is going to be that domestic childhood trauma can result in emotional and behavioral issues, including psychopathy later in life, and earlier therapy, especially that which includes intentional relationships, will result in better recovery. So I'm going to have an introduction section, which will include a definition section. And then my next section will be causes of childhood trauma, and then possible results or psychopathy of childhood trauma, and then what constitutes successful therapy or recovery for this trauma, and then finally my conclusion. So to go into a little bit more detail about those specific sections, my introduction is just going to be a general overview of my thesis, explaining what I'm going to be researching, and then describing my sources. And then I said before, within that, there will be a definition section. And so within that section, I'm going to specifically address what scholarly sources recognize as different types and levels of childhood trauma and varying approaches to treatment. And then I'm going to define important concepts, including psychopathy and recovery. The source that's going to do the most for that section is Aisha C. Hunter's piece that's titled An Investigation of Women's Experience of Recovering from Childhood Trauma and Subsequent Substance Abuse from the Indo-Pacific Journal of Phenomenology. And so that one I'm just going to refer to as Hunter's source from now on when referencing it. But just an example of a definition from there, she writes, unlike commonplace misfortunes, traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily integrity, or close personal encounter with violence and death. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the responses of catastrophe. And then she also goes on to say, trauma occurs when both internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with the external threat. So that's going to be a reference point for the rest of my research on what I classify as trauma, and then what counts as like recovery from that point. And there's a lot of other examples from her piece, her writing, that explain more concepts like that one. So then my next session for causes of childhood trauma, I'm going to be focusing mostly on domestic trauma, domestic abuse. And so I'm pulling a lot from a piece titled Traumatic Experiences in Childhood and Psychopathy, a study on a sample of violent offenders from Italy. And that has 3 authors, but I'm just going to be referencing that one as the Italy article from now on. So for this, it gives me, I can pull from there, and one piece I pulled from there was that it reads, all 22 participants reported having at least one traumatic experience in their own life. Among them, 17 participants reported early traumatic experiences. In more detail, 4 reported sexual abuse, 11 reported physical abuse, 9 reported emotional abuse, 15 reported emotional neglect. So those kind of categories, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and emotional neglect, are going to be kind of my focus on causes of childhood trauma. And I'm going to branch off a little bit more from those because obviously there's a lot more different sections I can grasp from that. But that was a source that really dove into these causes with these different individuals and what caused their trauma, or what was the root of their trauma, more correctly to say it that way. But so that would be that section, and that's the largest source. But obviously in any research that's being done on trauma, there is going to be that aspect of, okay, well, what kind of trauma is this? So that's going to be something that's going to be easily incorporated. But that was the biggest source I've seen thus far in my research that had this idea of specifying these types of trauma. And again, my definition section will come into play there as well, with defining what each type of trauma or what each level of trauma is according to each individual researcher, each respective researcher. The next section is the possible results and then specifically psychopathy of childhood trauma. So with that, I'm just trying to focus on a range of implications. So my 4 I'm kind of zeroing in on as of right now are neurological, behavioral, emotional, and relational implications. So with neurological, again, that's going to be the Hunter article, and then also a new article I haven't mentioned yet by Lauren Sparks, and it's titled Children Recovering from Complex Trauma, the Influence of Child, Family, and Community Level Factors. So I'll refer to that one as Sparks. So we have Hunter, Sparks, and then also the Italy one that comes into play here. But from the Hunter article, She explains that caregiver abuse or neglect indicates chronic and very severe coexisting problems with emotional regulation, impulse control, attention, and relationships. So that kind of hits on the emotional and relational implications. And then neurologically, victims of childhood trauma have greater midbrain cell growth, which results in lesser prefrontal cortex cell growth, pardon me. And that it results in an underdeveloped capacity for empathy. So that translates into emotional and also behavioral. And then there's kind of this more aggressive traits in these individuals that kind of, again, translates to the behavioral section. And then in the Sparks article, children with complex trauma experience more severe behavioral problems, and that's emphasized through a study on young children in grade school still. And then from the Italy article, they write that early trauma can result in desensitization, pardon me, to future painful or anxiety provoking experiences. And then that results in an individual that is less emotionally and physiologically responsive to the needs of others, and to be callous and lack empathy, and to lack remorse or guilt, which translates to psychopathy. So with that being said, the largest overlap in these articles is the simple fact that childhood trauma can be completely debilitating to one's future, and then also their biological, their emotional, their behavioral, their relational implications later in life. And then for what constitutes successful therapy and recovery. So that's going to be coming heavily from this Sparks article. And obviously I have a few more articles on that, but this is the one that I trust the most in right now, as I've given the most time to and just analyzed the most. And so we focus on the biggest thing is really interpersonal relationships and just these intentional relationships, whether that be in the form of parents, in the form of school teachers. But it says in this piece that the child trusting the caregiver to help them understand the trauma they experience leads to significantly improved outcomes, as does higher levels of school support. And then another approach is optimism and hopefulness. Being able to nurture that in kids is very helpful. And again, a point drawn from here that I'm going to work into this part of the essay is the younger the therapy, the younger this is able to be corrected and treated, is more beneficial to that individual's well-being in the future. And then my final section is my conclusion. And that's just going to be kind of reiterating the conclusions drawn from my research in more detail than I did in my introduction. So it'll be less defining things and more tying them together and bringing my sections together as a whole. And again, so just structured similar to my introduction, getting more general, but then kind of drawing this conclusion, my own conclusions on, and kind of adding that and tying all the researchers I've pulled from together into one cohesive statement at the end. So again, I apologize for the low quality of this video, just because it's dark out and me stumbling over my words at points, but thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all later, and hopefully at some point when my essay is finished. Bye all.